This is the Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 243, entitled Masculisting the Gender Politicians. Description. This flyer provides ideas on how the masculists can influence the gender politicians to menfair the gender laws, particularly menfairing the divorce laws and bringing in the paternity rejection right. The strongest threat against them is assassination. Milder forms are to convert women into female masculists, so that the combined bloc vote of men and bloc vote of female masculists is 60%. Then the gender laws will be menfaired. Flyer itself. Masculisting the Gender Politicians by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer is another in a series with the title Masculisting the ... This one concerns ideas on how the masculists can influence the gender politicians to make the gender laws fair to men, particularly regarding the divorce laws and the lack of a paternity rejection right. The masculists reserve their greatest hatred for the gender politicians because it's they who changed the divorce laws in the 70s that have resulted in tens of millions of men in the US being what the MGTOWs call divorce raped. That is, being criminally abused by divorce laws that were modified in the 70s to heavily favour women that were greatly at the expense of men. Individual feminazis are hated by the masculists because these feminazis have indirectly become genociders by having persuaded the gender politicians to pass divorce laws that financially massacre and ruin the lives of tens of millions of men. This is a major crime of historical proportions that should be hated the way the great tyrants of history should be hated. The gender politicians have caused mass misery for men on a massive scale, so it's to be expected that the masculists place them at the top of the list for their hatred. As men wake up to this divorce toxicity in large numbers, becoming MGTOWs and masculists, these gender politicians will become targets for assassination. Such is the level of hatred against them from the masculists. Consider what these gender politician monsters have done. They have made divorce, and hence marriage, toxic for men, so that now in Western countries about 2/3 of young men under 35 refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. They refuse to be divorce raped, so only pump and dump women, avoiding marriage and paternity like the plague. Thus these gender politicians have indirectly become genociders. They are the root cause of men's major gender problems. They have made divorce and hence marriage so toxic that young men are now crashing the birth rate, which in time will wipe out whole populations. So the gender politicians are genociders and hence have to be stopped. As populations seriously begin to fall, alarm bells will go off and measures will be called for by the voting public, by sages, that is intellectuals, by journalists, to stop the birth rate from plummeting. The masculists will be pushing very hard for the menfairing of the gender laws, particularly regarding the divorce laws and the lack of a so that having a child with a woman is not a game of Russian roulette, with 1 chance in 4, roughly, of being financially massacred and having his life ruined. As the population falls, moral and political pressure on the gender politicians will increase strongly. People will argue that there's nothing more important to human beings than the survival of human beings. So if the gender politicians don't menfair the gender laws, then they deserve to be murdered, and that is what will happen. Dozens of gender politicians will be assassinated, so these gender politicians ought to listen to the masculists for their own survival. To continue to ignore the massive crime they are committing against men will be to invite their own assassination. The threat of assassination is the strongest argument the masculists have against the gender politicians. The masculists will kill these gender political criminals who care nothing for the well-being of half the population, the male half, and hence deserve to die. Before assassinating dozens of gender politicians, the masculists will try more benign methods, such as moral and political persuasion. But there's a problem here, and that problem is female nature. Women are amoral when it comes to their own self-interest and financial survival regarding being supported by a male. Women evolved to be parasitic on men. In the distant past, a woman who could not attract the attention of a man to give her and her babies scarce male-hunted meat often did not survive. So at a very deep level, women have an ingrained attitude that men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies, so that when there's a divorce, and if the man was paying for the woman to have babies in a house he owns, then she expects him to continue paying for her after the divorce. The current feminazi-dominated divorce laws reflect these female attitudes. It was the fluffy feminists who pushed for these divorce laws in the 70s in the first place. The gender politicians of the time gave the women what they wanted because the women were pushing hard for them, and the men offered no opposition because they were not conscious of what they were giving away. Half a century later, with tens of millions of US men divorced, raped, and murderously angry and bitter, having had their children ripped away from them, losing their house and half their possessions given to his ex-wife, forced to pay child support to kids he barely sees, and often alimony to his fluffy ex-wife, so his fluffy ex-wife can continue to parasite him after the divorce, as she did before the divorce. Women are 51% of the voters, and women vote more readily than men. So the gender politicians will have a difficult moral decision to make if they listen to the arguments of the masculists. That is, that the gender politicians must menfair the gender laws to stop the birth rate from plummeting, to make men more willing to be fathers again, as they will if the gender laws are made menfair. This leaves the gender politicians in a quandary. If they menfair the gender laws, then the fluffy feminists and women in general will scream at losing their divorce privileges. It's very nice for women to give custody of the kids with. It's very nice for women to be given custody of the kids with a 90% probability. Be given half of her ex-husband's possessions, his house, and often alimony, so that she doesn't have to FIP up. That is, become a FIP, a financially independent person, by bothering to get a career-competent education and earn a decent salary. Women like the current divorce laws because they are so favourable to, so biased in favour of women, so they'll be very reluctant to have to give them up. If the gender politicians threaten to do just that, then millions of women, fluffy feminist hypocrite women, will threaten to vote out the gender politicians at the next election, especially if the gender politicians threaten to legalise the para, which is the greatest threat to women because it would force them to become FIPs, which frightens fluffy women shitless. Fluffies like living off the money of a man. That way they can remain child women, not having to take responsibility for their own female lives. They can continue to be children taken care of by the labour and money of a man. Thus the gender politicians are stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, if they do nothing, that is, the gender laws remain status quo, then the MGTOWs and Masculists will continue to boycott marriage and fatherhood, and the birth rate will continue to fall, and with it the population. The gender politicians will also be at risk of being assassinated by bitter, murderously angry Masculists, whose lives the gender politicians are destroying. On the other hand, if they do give the Masculists, and men in general, what they want, then the women, the fluffies, the fluffy feminists, will start screaming and vote them out at the next election. So what can the gender politicians do? ? Many will do nothing, as they have been doing for the past 40 years, since the feminazi-dominated divorce laws came in the 70s. But this passive strategy will become increasingly dangerous, both physically for their own survival with the threat of masculist assassins' bullets, and politically as the temperature rises in the debate over the population crash. The gender politicians will feel a political heat as more and more people focus their attention on the dwindling population and the possibility of it dying out completely. I think the solution for the gender politicians' problem will be as follows. There is a way for the gender laws to be menfaired without the gender politicians being assassinated nor being voted out, and that is to have women become female masculists. This is a task for the MGTOWs, at least the politically minded ones, and the masculists. Masculists need to persuade women that it's in their self-interest to become female masculists and vote together with men to menfair the gender laws. Otherwise, women will be punished by men, MGTOW style, by not getting a man and hence not getting a baby. If women don't vote with men on menfairing the gender laws, then quality men will refuse to give women their sperm and will only relate with women on a pump and dump basis, not wanting to have relationships with them, choosing to live on their own. Going their own way, not wanting to be divorce raped in the fluffy feminist hypocrite / feminazi dominated divorce courts. Masculists need to put enormous moral pressure on women to fip up and vote with men to menfair the gender laws, or they'll be punished by men by being manless and particularly babyless, which is the chief fear of women, who after all are evolved to be baby factories and childminders. Their whole DNA is geared towards those ends. Once the gender politicians can read the opinion polls that about 60% of the population is in favour of menfairing the gender laws due to the combined bloc vote of men plus the bloc vote of female masculists, then they will agree to menfair the gender laws. The masculists will simultaneously be putting enormous moral pressure on fluffies to fip up, so that the supply of fluffies dwindles as more women make the effort to fip up to become career competent by bothering to get a career competent education. Fit women will be much less financially and existentially threatened by the bringing in of the para. If fit women end up with sole financial responsibility of the kid due to the father rejecting responsibility for it, then she will be able to afford to pay for the kid because she's a fip, not a financially useless, child-minded, bloody fluffy. So the masculists have a lot of social engineering to do over the next few decades to get women off their fluffy, parasitic bums and forced to fip up. Otherwise, they are punished by men by not getting one. The masculists will put enormous moral pressure on young women to get a career-competent education or be punished by not getting a man, being manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, poor and spat at by a society ever more favourable to men's needs, more masculist in its thinking. Thus privately, quietly, it is in the self-interest of the gender politicians to support the masculists in their efforts to force women to fip up and to get the gender laws menfaired. Once nearly all women are fips, it will be much easier for the gender politicians to menfair the gender laws, bringing in the para, menfairing the divorce laws, for example, by making custody of the kids joint, by throwing out alimony, expecting that women are to be fips and not parasite off a man, making him a man-slave to her, by allowing the original owners of the house to keep it, etc. The gender politicians will have to be careful with their public expressions of being in favour of masculism, because before the 60% combined vote is a reality, women will still have the bloc voting power to throw them out of office at the next election if the feminazi organisations get wind of the fact that certain gender politicians are pro-masculist, pushing for women to fip up and for the gender laws to be menfaired, which would run so counter to the fluffy feminist hypocrites' self-interests. But as masculist ideas penetrate and influence society, the majority number of voters who want the menfairing of the gender laws will become larger, making it safer for the gender politicians to come out in public saying that they are pro-menfairing, and will start changing the gender laws, making them fairer to men, as a means to stop the birth rate from plummeting, so that men are more prepared to be fathers again. Many men want to be fathers, but don't dare to be in today's gynocentric society, with the divorce court so heavily biased against men, and with too many women still being fluffy parasites, expecting men to be man-slaves to them, so that they can sit on their fat parasitic asses and live off the money of a man. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channels De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers, and De Garis Essays. Ciao.